All right, guys. So thank you so much for joining us today for our live Q&A. We want this to be as interactive as possible. The more questions you have, the better. We're going to try and get to as many as we can. And we'll do it in a first come, first serve basis in terms of like when you raise your hand. So if you want to ask a question, in the bottom of your screen, you'll see the reactions button. If you click on that, there's a button to raise your hand. So if you do have a question, use that hand raise button. And then in the chat, throw your question in there and we'll answer them in kind of priority order of when they're asked. I wanted to start the conversation today with a little bit of context around stress. And I'm sure Mara is going to have something to add on to this as well, in that we want to draw a clear line in the sand between acute stress and chronic stress. Acute stress being a singular bout of stress, an incident, event, or stimulus of some kind, which is actually could be considered a good thing, right? A stressor in terms of a training session, right? It's a strategically applied stress that creates an adaptation. It could be a good stress in terms of a marriage or a baby being born or something very positive in your life. But stress is stress is stress. It's all cortisol. And then when we get into chronic stress, the repetitive exposure to that cortisol has systemic effects on the body and reduces our ability, in a simplified form, it reduces our ability to recover and to adapt. Because in order for us to adapt, that stressor needs to be removed. We need to be able to recover from that stressor and super compensate. So we wanted to open up. Well, Mary, do you want to add anything in terms of like contextual to that?
Yeah, I was going to say that, to what Paul was saying with regard to like happy stressors, these are often things that people negate as big events in their life. And this is where we have, like what he was saying, that compounding effect, where if I ask a client, hey, let's make a timeline of just big things, whether they're happy or, tragic, most people just think about stress as a bad thing. And obviously we want to build that resilience regardless, but it is that compounding effect. And this is where even, preparation for a wedding, whether it's yours, your daughter's, or your son's, and all the things that go into it, catering and getting a family in town, out of town. And then that's not even dealing with like your work and, your home life. And then this is where things start mounting up. And that's where we have to, just be really thoughtful to what we really are asking of ourselves and making sure here again, those outside things such as, even training, like that's a positive thing and that we need to do, but we need to be making sure that we're recovering from all these pieces.
Our stress can serve us or it can serve to break us down. Yeah. And that's ultimately what we want to avoid. Yeah. So at this point, we'd love to open up the door for any questions. I know there are coaches in here, there are athletes in here, there are fitness enthusiasts in here. So there's going to be questions from multiple domains, and the more the better. So does anyone want to open us up with our first question of the night? Don't all raise your hands at once. Carol, yeah.
Okay, do you want me to write my question down or can I just say it?
Just ask it, it's fine.
Okay, don't want to go against protocol.
You get kicked out.
Yeah, get kicked out. I have a few clients that it's very challenging for them to do exactly what you're suggesting here, to figure out what is acute stress and what is chronic stress. They're just, it's chronic. It's like, I try to explain it to them and maybe I'm not getting through to them. I don't know, but I think I explained it pretty clearly, kind of like what you just said. But they don't buy into it necessarily. And they think, oh, I can manage it on my own. Like, yeah, but are you? Right? So what do you say to those people that are a little resistant and thinking that, it's not a big deal? I mean, like you guys, I've been doing this for a long time, and every so often you run into those people that you just, I can't get a home run.
So is it that what is going on within their life is hindering them from achieving their goals?
It, in my opinion, I think it stems from trauma. So even from years ago, they
absolutely. So they're having this compounding effect where they're having trouble achieving some sort of goal, and it's coming from an exorbitant amount of stress that perhaps is not necessarily acutely happening right now, but it's that compounding effect that they haven't perhaps dealt with some internal stress, and that's showing with their feedback in their body. I would talk to them about just that. That being said, for myself, when I talk to clients, I also want to make sure that I'm coming from a place of abundance, and that I'm never trying to make a client feel that they need to pull all the things out.
No.
If you have a client and they're training like 7 days a week, and they're doing cardio 7 days a week, and for myself, I definitely think that that is a stressor that we could control. Absolutely. We can't have them quit their jobs, but this is something where I'd say not pulling their training out completely, but talking to them about, hey, let's reduce this down to 5 days a week. That right there could be, pretty traumatic depending on the client that you're talking about, because that is their identity. They identify with that. So even helping them to go through that process of finding things outside of what they only identify with can be helpful. And it can take a really slow milking that process with the client, and really a lot of hand holding, but that's kind of how I approach things.
This client, and that's how this client is actually not very active. She's been through chemotherapy, breast cancer. So her identity is cancer. Oh, I'm this survivor, and it drives her nuts.
But does it drive her nuts?
Yeah, that being considered a cancer survivor. She doesn't like it. It's like, I've done it, I need to move on. So quit reminding me of it, But hers is more trauma from the way she was brought up. So I'm not an expert at trauma, but I am trauma informed. So I understand it, but I don't know how to speak in her terms necessarily. And we brought it up, we brought it up a couple of times that her past really, we need to deal with that. It needs to be dealt with because it's hindering.
Will she speak to somebody?
She is.
Can I ask, in what way is it hindering her? You haven't really identified like what the specific barrier she's facing is.
She is defiant on, even though she hired me, she's aware of this. She's defiant on, she wants to do things her way on her terms. So she can't get past me suggesting things or us. It takes a long time for her and I to come to an agreement on even, hey, let's make sure you pack your lunch every day. I mean, it took like 2 sessions to see what I'm saying, because she wants to be so in control because of the trauma she's experienced in her past. I don't know if you've experienced this with anyone, that she can't let go of the control. So it takes us a couple hours for her to release this control. The stress of her trauma is just, it shuts her down. She just has to have total control. I've never experienced anyone quite like this. So it's very interesting.
It would seem to me that someone who craves control would want to control these variables towards their goal. So they would tend to cling to things that are within their control. But you're saying she's actually clinging to chaos in that.
Yeah, she's aware of that. Yeah.
Um,
Isn't that crazy?
it's not crazy. So I'm coming at this from my background in disability rehabilitation. So
Yeah.
we've dealt with a lot of very complex mental illness.
Yeah.
And she might be dealing with some sort of post-traumatic stress response to the
She
chemotherapy
is.
or even her childhood. And
She is.
in that instance, we need to do two things. We need to challenge her limiting beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
We also cannot challenge her values. So we need
Oh no.
to make sure that we are educating with hard data to show these are the results you get when you do X, Y, and Z.
Right. Okay.
We need to attempt, if you want a different result, you need to go through a different process.
Yes.
And this is where we get into the collaborative coaching element that I would get into is what sort of change would you feel comfortable making?
Mm-hmm.
Here are some options.
I've done that.
And
I do that. That's exactly how I speak to her all the time. It's wonderful. It's very calm and loving and gentle.
It's empathetic.
She picks. She chooses.
And she still is not committing to those changes.
She's still really resistant. She surprised me. She did commit to one goal, and it was like celebration time. And she felt really good about that. So
I think
we have our baby successes. But I'm specifically asking, is my wording not right with her?
Well,
I do the
motivation.
I come at it with an empathetic.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're taking more of a motivational interviewing strategy, which is very much appropriate. I would say that in this instance, there are two things that we need to focus on. Number one is if you are getting little wins, that in itself is fantastic, and you should
it is.
Continue to build small bits of momentum.
Right.
And it might be slower than you're comfortable with, but don't allow that to
No, it's not about me.
Have you
my comfort level.
Right. So you may be doing a fantastic job in her eyes. That's why she wants to continue to work with you.
Mm-hmm.
But it might be slower than you would expect. So you second guess yourself, it seems.
Yeah, I'm just making sure that I'm not making it worse and making sure.
It doesn't sound like you are. And then the next one for me is there may come a time with this client, and we've all been there, or we should have been there at some point the longer we coach. This might just be outside your wheelhouse, and you'd be doing a disservice to continue to work with this person.
I even told her that.
Yeah, and it might be the case that the best thing you can do for her is provide her with a few referrals to some people that specialize in this area.
Yep.
And leave her to it.
Wonderful. Good. Okay, so we're thinking along the same lines. I appreciate that.
For sure.
Thank you.
For sure, no problem. Anyone else? Questions? I'm happy to spout off on whatever you want me to spout off on. Anything, guys, anything goes. Like, we're talking about stress, we're talking about training, we're talking about coaching, we're talking about nutrition, we're talking about recovery, adaptive response, like whatever you want to know, we will hit on it, and I'm sure it will spark even more conversation. No question is dumb. Nick, what's up? You might be muted, bud.
I guess I just wanted to ask how effective is using a weight belt. I've basically taken 10 years off from deadlifting, and I'm looking to get my strength up quite a bit. I just want to see how much more productive I will be with a weight belt on if I'm just kind of breaking back into it.
Okay, so Nick, that's not really an appropriate question for the subject matter we're trying to discuss here. We're trying to discuss, stress and how that will affect training, not specifically, what sorts of equipment to use while training. can you ask me that question privately, perhaps in a DM, and I'd be happy to answer it. But for today, we're going to try and focus on specifically stress and training. Lucy is asking, can we talk a little bit about setting up nutrition and training for clients that experience a lot of daily stress? Mary, do you want to just hit a couple key points and then we'll kind of go back and forth on it?
Yeah, I'm just reading the question now. Can you talk about setting up nutrition and training for clients that experience a lot of daily stress? So keep it simple. It's going to be my first suggestion, is absolutely keep it simple. Meet the client where the client is at, not necessarily where you want the client to be at, because it'll be our goal as coaches to get them there. This could look like there's so many different, interventions. This could look like, did you hit, eat 4 to 5 meals per day? Mark an X. This could be as advanced as, I need you to hit X amount of protein per day and X amount of fats per day. But step one is, I would absolutely say, if someone's experiencing daily stress and we're wanting to scale their nutrition, is keep it as simple as possible, because you're not wanting nutrition to be another stress to them. And often it is. Either you're going to have a client that might be extremely like to the gram of everything and worried about that there's 7 seeds on their raspberry and not 8. And does that count as an extra gram? Or you're going to have the other client that it's absolutely scary to start weighing or tracking their food, or, that they even have to count, how many times they eat a day. So that's going to be, it's kind of a broad question, but that's kind of how I would start it.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Mary, have you ever so it's something that I do. If I have a client who's super stressed and really busy, can't think, I've actually asked them, do you want me to write you a meal plan? Right? It's like, you don't have to think about anything. You just got to put the food in your face. It's like, here you go, eat this every day.
Yeah, I actually did that today with a new client who's never tracked food or done anything. We're at the level of X marks the bot, scratch an X here. She has 4 kids. Her husband works on an oil rig out in the ocean for most of the year. And she is wanting to do good for herself and be healthy. And so we're at the X marks the spot. And so we're doing that. She is succeeding. We're going from 3 X's a week to 5 X's a week. But today I said, hey, can I just provide you just a sample guideline on how you might want to look at things? And I did that. And she was like, whoa, that's so much crazy food. And I was like, hey, let's do one better. Let me give you this awesome 8-page list. And it literally lists out, these are protein sources. These are starchy, carbs. And I say, hey, pick 2 from each column and just go wild with it. No restraints, no restrictions. No, you can only have this. I just said, just go wild, have fun, just have fun with it. She's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, let's eat, girl. And knowing full well she's not going to go smorgasbord, that got her excited. Because I told her, I was like, you can't do wrong unless you don't eat. That's going to be wrong. I was like, but if you eat, that's awesome.
Right. Now, I absolutely echo everything Mary said about keeping it simple, making sure that they can adhere to it, and meeting them where they are. You're not going to give them something that's going to cause them additional stress. You're going to want something that fits seamlessly into the framework of their day and maybe isn't as big of a deviation from the norm as you would want it to be, but is still trending towards where the goals are in terms of nutrition. And then on the training side, now, if you're dealing with somebody who is acutely stressed, maybe going through exam period or, tons of big work deadlines, an easy strategy is just to deload, right? A lot of people forget that the amount of volume required to maintain an adaptation is about 30% of the amount of volume required to build strength or hypertrophy. So if we pull back training for 2 weeks, we're not going to lose any adaptation. We might lose a little bit of motor control. We might lose a little bit of that, neurological snappiness, but the adaptation of hypertrophy and strength will go nowhere, and you'll be able to adapt to that stressor. The other option is continuing to push your training, but decreasing total volume, or potentially keeping total volume the same and decreasing intensity somewhat. Volume tends to be the driver of fatigue a little bit more so than intensity. So I would probably opt to keep intensity as high as possible while reducing volume. If you're doing 3 sets of an exercise, go down to 2 or even 1. One really, really hard set, put everything you have into it and then move on. Right? So those are a couple strategies there. If you're dealing with someone undergoing chronic stress, here's when you're going to have to monitor as many variables as you can, right? Monitor their progressions, monitor their movement qualities, monitor their subjective ratings of fatigue, how they feel they're performing, these sorts of things. And that'll give you a lot of information on how to modify the training as you move forward. You may not be able to progress them in a linear fashion. You might have to give them a lot of guidelines on, if you're feeling good, do X. If you're not feeling good, do Y, right? Allowing them the opportunity to listen to their own bodies can also be very effective, more so a strategy for advanced lifters than beginner lifters. I would probably opt just to deload them more often, push training for 2 to 3 weeks, back off 1 week, right back into it. That's the easiest strategy for like a chronic stress situation. Yeah.
I want to say 2 other things with regard to nutrition. So some of the questions are general, but I see a little more specific one coming down the line. But I just want to say, for somebody who is experiencing like that chronic stress, they also might have like an impaired digestive capacity. So understanding that most people will say chronic stress, and I'm not saying carbs are bad, let's please get that out. But they're like, oh, you need more carbs, which true. One is someone who's under chronic stress doesn't need to be in a deficit. However, somebody who's under chronic stress could have impaired digestion, to which you can't actually be pushing calories. That would negate that entire concept of giving them more food, because that could put more kerosene on a fire, causing stress within their body. Because if someone's undergoing chronic stress, likelihood they are going to be starting to experience some sort of leaky gut. That is going to translate to, obviously brain fog, hormonal function. And so this is where you have to be just a little bit thoughtful and to maybe look at their biofeedback that you're getting from them on what they're doing. Also with blood sugar fluctuations with these people, if people are still having like a high amount of cortisol output, understanding that blood sugar regulation is going to be a problem for them. And so next question with regard to sleep, they might be waking up frequently because they don't have the ability to control that blood sugar. And so this might be where you don't necessarily need to get into the weeds with them, depending on who the client is, but you as a coach might need to say, hey, let's make sure we have a little bit of carbs and some fruit around bedtime. Yeah. If you want to go into like liver glycogen, you can, but just be thoughtful. Chronic stress people, we're going to be thinking blood sugar dysregulation, and potentially digestive situations. So be thoughtful that we don't want to diet this person. They are not in a place to diet if they don't have their stress management underway, but we also don't need to be pushing calories because that could be a stressor to the body.
Interesting. Yeah. People always forget that cortisol is a fuel mobilizer. So if you have high cortisol, you're going to have a high fasted blood glucose. And a good way to get cortisol to come down is to spike insulin with carbs. But if you already have high blood glucose, you could get into an insulin resistant situation and feed that cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So Dawn's question is, I'm still recovering from all kinds of hormonal issues, adrenal fatigue, estrogen dominance, low test. But now after feeding up for so long, I'm having insulin resistance issues. What advice would you give to someone in my shoes? Oof. You know what? I'm going to defer the question.
Okay.
More so Mayor's wheelhouse.
Yeah, I just have to read it again. Sorry. It's a lot on that question.
So training side, but on the nutrition, I'll definitely defer to you.
Yeah, so understanding with the adrenal fatigue, I'm going to say that needs to be worked on first, because adrenals, those are your governors, people. You can do all you want or try to do all you want with your hormones, and it ain't going to do anything if those adrenals have like left the chapel. So adrenals is going to be huge. I'll let Paul, when he talks about the training portion of that, working on nourishing the adrenals, which does not necessarily mean stimulating them. That could also go really wonky. Estrogen dominance with adrenal fatigue, understand that this person typically has been under a long-term chronic stress. This is, the happy, the sad, the trauma, all the things. And for females, if this is a female, if we are having, which we are, issues with regard to hormones, that has been long-term. Okay. So hormones typically don't show up as like the first player, although they can, but typically not. Typically they're the last ones to join the table as far as that kind of hierarchy goes. So seeing the estrogen dominance, I don't know if this is relative or absolute estrogen dominance. I'm thinking because we have low tests that probably that estrogen's not really high. It's just high in relationship to progesterone, maybe not. But I'm going to say caution with touching anything with hormones, because if you can work on the adrenals, understanding that will also help with insulin resistance, that is going to give some love everywhere else with regard to thyroid, digestion, which here again, if adrenals are touched on, you're going to have some sort of leaky gut piece, whether there's a dysbiosis or not. But going after the adrenals, absolutely first. And really, like, I cannot emphasize this enough. With regard to true adrenal adaptation, you have to get your house in order. And your new job is boundaries, stress management, and that can be so I literally have had the t-shirt. Like I have the t-shirt. I am probably teetering on the t-shirt right now. But if you are dealing with actual adrenal adaptation, that is now your new job, is to work on that. You can still train. I still have my clients train during this time. It does need to differ. There is not going to be a contest prep during this time. There's not going to be a meet prep during this time. I believe training is a positive thing for the body, long as it is programmed appropriately. And this typically is where that volume and intensity needs to be thoughtful. So I'll kind of let Paul talk about that.
So in this instance, we would essentially we're trying to lower systemic stress, right? So want to provide enough of a stressor to the body that we can get an adaptation from it, but not so much of a stressor that we dig ourselves a hole, because essentially what we're trying to do on the nutrition and stress management side is fill the hole. So if our training is digging that hole deeper, we're feeding the cycle. So what I would probably end up doing is looking at the training plan as a whole, dropping intensity down to like a 3 RIR. So not pushing to failure on any sets. And just to put that into perspective, 3 RIR is still a really hard set. Okay. If you've ever been on a leg press to 3 RIR, that's a really friggin' hard set, but it's not failure. So 3 RIR, then I would look at total volume. I would look at, okay, can we reduce the total volume to a minimum effective dose? Understanding that total adaptive response is probably between 8 and 20 sets per body part. Bring them down to 8, right? We're not necessarily in a period where we want to build strength or build tons of muscle, but we do want to have some sort of adaptive response. So bring them down closer to that 8 sets total body part, then getting into, okay, are we doing any sort of cardiovascular activity? If so, no more HIIT. Keep the intensity down, keeping it to less. Right? Not even miss. I would say taking out any sort of exercise that would build up to any lactate, I would take it out. I would take out any supersets. I would take out anything that would allow us to spike heart rate too much. If the situation was very dire, I would take out any sort of compound lifts that would spike blood pressure. And then erring on the side of NEAT or step count to get in total activity throughout the day. That's probably going to be more effective to help with the insulin resistance situation, because the research is quite clear that 5-10 minute bouts of activity is better than 1 50-minute bout of activity when it comes to systemic response, insulin regulation, things of that nature. So spreading out your activity throughout the day, and then we can look at decreasing frequency, right? So if you're training 4 times, drop down to 3. If we're doing a body part split, potentially working down to a full body 3 times a week. and allowing us to kind of auto-regulate from there based on how we're feeling and how we're seeing any results. It's really an iterative process.
That's like a really good point that Paul brought up with regard to compound lifts. I hadn't even thought about that with regard to like adrenals specifically. Meryl, you asked about focusing on healing. So remember that the adrenals, they're producing cortisol and also aldosterone, right? And aldosterone is responsible for basically sodium retention. And so when cortisol is high, we will also see aldosterone high. But during adrenal adaptation, we see the opposite. So we see cortisol is now going to be low, and we start to see that aldosterone will also decline. And so this is where that sodium potassium balance, as well as calcium and magnesium balance, also start to fluctuate, because nothing is in isolation, people, right? And remembering what those minerals are doing as far as muscle contraction, and as well as like blood pressure. And so this is where you hear that like dizziness with, or orthostatic hypertension. So people that, maybe stand up, get dizzy, they sit down and they get dizzy, things like that, that can all be kind of calling card signs that it's not necessarily blood sugar. It could be somebody that is going through a little bit too much chronic stress, and maybe, here again, so many different things, but that would be something that if your clients, hey, I'm always tired, or I feel like my legs are so heavy, and then they start making comments about dizziness, things like that.
Even easier way to test this. Okay, if you're fatigued one day, do a plank. You will shake like a leaf in the wind.
That is not fair. I think he's calling me out on my training session. Like,
No. So, we talk about mineral balance, we talk about muscle contraction. If you are in a stressed situation and you're carrying a lot of fatigue, your ability to stabilize under load is going to be drastically reduced. So one thing that I notice with clients, I notice with myself, and is kind of really a calling card of carrying excess fatigue. If you go to do a single leg RDL, you won't be able to balance. You'll be all over your foot. If you go to do a kettlebell bottoms up press or carry, you'll be unable to stabilize that shoulder. You go to do a plank, you'll be shaking and having all these, oscillations. It's because your neurological system cannot coordinate muscle contraction in unstable environments because you have an imbalance of those minerals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was a great question.
Y'all are on fire now. Keep them coming.
Yeah, we're rolling.
I think there was a sleep one we missed.
What's that?
I think there was a sleep one when we missed, or did we touch on that? How does acute short-term affect training, lack of sleep? I guess we did touch on that, Aaron.
Yeah, we did. I mean, if lack of sleep is a chronic thing, can it be fixed, right? Can we alter our bedtime? Can we have better sleep hygiene? Can we set better boundaries around our work schedule, right? Setting an alarm to turn off your computer, right? Like as soon as we're done this call, my computer's closing and I'm done work for the night. 8 o'clock is my cutoff.
Asking them why though, too. That's
yeah.
As a coach, I'll be honest, like I'm always learning. And one thing I just learned about a client I've had for like a year, because it became her new normal, right? She's getting up 3 times a night to pee. And I'm like, excuse me? Why is this not on your check-in sheet? Like, why, why? And here again, I had to have the discussion about, let's talk about water consumption. Her water consumption wasn't too high, but I actually brought it down. That could also go into adrenals and stress and all those things, but asking them, are they getting up multiple times a night to urinate? Are they snoring? Are they sleeping with their mouth open? Do they have sleep apnea? Have they been tested? Like, these are all questions that sound silly, but they do matter.
Yeah, they totally matter. Sleep is one of the things that like, it kind of sneaks up on you. Like you don't really realize your sleep sucks until it sucks.
Until the morning times to wake up and you're like, damn it, it's been like 7 weeks like this.
So you start getting emails from me at 3:30 in the morning. But the one thing we've alluded to on a number of times when we've been answering these questions is data. So one of the most beneficial things that we can do on a daily basis is track data. And this can be, there's been a bit of a sensationalization around Aura rings, HRV, all these wearable digital devices. I'll be the first to say that those provide a tremendous amount of objective-ish data. Okay, they are limited by algorithms, they're limited by measurement accuracy and things of that nature, but they're reliable. Okay, they will provide you the same measurement under the same context repeatedly. So we could use that data to make decisions. Where I'd like to do it is, if I have that data, that's great. But if I wake up feeling tired, that's going to trump whether my HRV was good or not. So what I like to do is I like to have my clients track a number of subjective metrics. Things like digestion, libido, mood, energy levels, appetite, mental clarity, productivity, focus. And that could go on and on, depending on the needs of that individual. I vary what we're tracking, what we're not. And that allows me to then make better links, identify better trends in data to look at, okay, this person's macros on this day were X, and they had a fantastic day across the board subjectively. The next day, their sleep was low, energy was fine, but their focus was down. And then the next day, they had a really bad training session. So can we make these links or make these correlations between the things that we're noticing day to day, how that's being impacted by our ability to recover, and consequently, how that's being affected by our ability to perform the thing that we want to do, which is training in life. I think a lot of the times conversations around training are directed towards those for whom training is a means to an end. What I mean by that is an athlete, right? So if I'm talking to an athlete, the conversation around training is a non-negotiable. If you're an athlete, you have to train. So if you're not going to train, you're not going to get the result that you want. If I'm talking to my mother, she can miss a training day. She's not going to die, and it'll probably do her a lot of good because she trains like a fucking animal. But if she misses a training day because she didn't sleep well, or maybe she had a couple extra glasses of wine that night before, and it would behoove her to maybe go for a longer walk, drink a little bit more water that day, and then get back on the horse the next. That's probably going to do her a service rather than forcing a training session. So I think a lot of the conversations that we end up having around training and stress center around athletes for whom training is a non-negotiable. But we need to realize that training is probably the easiest stressor we have at our disposal to manipulate. You think about that person who's got, deadlines at work. Mayor mentioned like 4 kids. Maybe they've got a long commute and they sit in traffic and they're just pissed off all the time. Well, they have no control over that. They have to do those things. They can't just put their kids in a crate like I do with my dogs. I mean, they could, but it's probably frowned upon. So maybe manipulating their training and having them train a little less would benefit them. The caveat here is, for many people, training is a stress reducer. It's a coping strategy. You know why? Because it's cathartic.
Yep.
People treat and this is going to be a really polarizing statement, but I'm going to say it anyway. People treat training the same way people with mental illness treat cutting.
Yep.
Causes them pain. And through that pain, they get a release of endorphins, which makes them feel better the next day or immediately after.
Yeah.
And I apologize if that offends anybody, but it's a very, very clear comparison to make. And I can say it because I've done it. I've never cut myself, but I've absolutely used training as a means to punish myself and get those endorphins right afterwards. I feel like shit. I'm going to go squat 500 for 20 reps. I'm going to feel better afterwards, but I'll probably feel like dying immediately. And I got really, really strong doing it because I was also really young. And now I have the knees of a fucking 87-year-old and I'm held together by duct tape and hopes and dreams. So there we are. So If you're going to help someone manage their stress by reducing training, and for that person, training is a stress reducer or a coping strategy, your job as a coach is to help them establish new coping strategies and to help them realize that in the long term, using training as a coping strategy is not sustainable. And that is where, if you can do that with somebody, in my opinion, you're a fucking amazing coach. That was probably one of the hardest things for me as an athlete to realize, is that I can't use training as a coping strategy anymore. I had to figure it out. Training was my identity. Well, now I'm just a guy who trains. Training is not my identity.
Yeah. I often talk to my clients about finding joy in their life. And what I've come to realize, again, I don't mean to offend anybody, is not a lot of people remember what joy is like. The last time you remember joy, like truly, is perhaps, depending on your childhood, some time when you were a kid, when we were naive and just, whatever, laying in the grass, staring at the blue sky and, looking for the purple elephant with pink polka dots. Most of my clients, whenever I talk to them about joy or why they're doing this, why do you want to achieve their goal? I ask them, how will that make you feel? Like, I want to know, how is it going to feel to achieve your goal? And that's really hard for a lot of clients to even go there, because I think they have been dealing, like you said, with Paul, like everything has been a coping strategy or some self-sabotaging dialogue that they have with them, that they're undeserving of feeling good.
Absolutely.
We went dark there. Meryl asked, can expand on focusing on healing the adrenals. So with regard to healing the adrenals, basically it's not that we're just taking a supplement and replacing some vitamin or mineral that they've lost. Our adrenals are helping us deal with stress, their immune response, and that has downregulated. And so when that has downregulated, we have to pull back on most of the time, more excessively pull back than you think on all these stressors that are within your life. It's doing major life audits, calming down, like I said, finding joy again, taking things slower again. Those are all things that are nourishing to the body. Bringing safety, I guess, is the best way to describe it, is bringing safety back to your body, so it's not on this heightened, hyper vigilant place at all times. When the adrenals have adapted, typically our immune response is either very heightened or then very suppressed. So some people could be getting sick chronically. Some people can just never seem to get over something. And so this is, again, nourishing the immune system, nourishing that stress response, so it's not so active all the time. And that can take a long time, depending on the person's lifestyle and what they truly can pull back from. This might be those conversations with a client with regarding doing an audit of their life, even their job. Can you have a client quit their job? Absolutely not. But maybe that does happen. I was one of those people where that red line in my career came, and I needed to make a choice. And it was either a choice for my health or continuing doing this hamster wheel that wasn't serving me any longer. And it's having those conversations with clients and thinking about life a little bit differently. All those things are nourishing to the body, are nourishing to the adrenals, are nourishing to the immune system, so that we're not calling on it so often and being in that hypervigilant state.
Or you can take some Vyvanse and hammer some ashwagandha.
No, I do not recommend that. Although I will say, if we are talking supplements with regard to adrenal adaptation, you really want to be thoughtful and careful with the adaptogens that you do utilize with this client. If you do think you have a client with adrenal adaptation, I recommend, number one, making sure you get a full, complete, thorough blood work. You also need to get a Dutch adrenal, because just looking at serum cortisol one point in the morning is not going to tell the full picture of that diurnal pattern. It's not going to tell the metabolites that are also happening, and looking at DHEA. So if you do think you're in a place of having a client that you didn't have a mismatched cortisol pattern, so maybe they're wired at night and in the morning they can sleep all day, or they're just flatlined all day, you need to see what you are working with. Otherwise, you could be giving somebody who says they're tired, they don't necessarily have adrenal adaptation. You can have freaking high cortisol and be exhausted because those neurotransmitters are going all the time. And quite the opposite. I've had a client where they were doing blood work and her cortisol came back like a 30, but her symptoms just weren't matching up to me. And so I said, hey, can we please just do a Dutch adrenal? Sure as shit, her morning cortisol waking response through the freaking ceiling. The rest of the day, she was below flat line right across. So here again, I wouldn't know that, and I wouldn't know how to support her with that. And again, testing, you can see what to support. Not everybody should have glandulars, meaning like bovine, adrenal, or spleen glandulars. They don't need that. And in fact, if you give somebody just based off of symptoms, glandulars, you could be pouring kerosene on a fire and really be a bad situation. That, and using other things like licorice, for example. So licorice helps that conversion of deactivation from cortisone to cortisol. And here again, if you're not really sure what's happening with that person and you're trying to free up more cortisol, but they have a shit ton of cortisol, well, that's no good. Or if they have blood pressure issues, that's going to be horrible. So really looking and testing. And I think that back to the ashwagandha is a relatively safe adaptogen to use because it is not stimulating. Ginseng is stimulating. So just really be thoughtful when you're trying to work with your clients on those things.
What about the Vyvanse though? I can still handle for Vyvanse?
I am just not going to even just stop.
Okay, fine. Modafinil. I'll just stick with modafinil.
No, God damn it. Although that would be like job security. So yes, give that to your client and then I will take your client and fix them.
Me.
What's that?
I'm the poster boy for this right now because I'm coming off of prep and my cortisol levels throughout prep are probably like off the charts.
Yes, absolutely at some point. I kind of wonder, like just opening up your can in front of everybody. I do wonder because when I start seeing other things happen, I have been so surprised. And this is why at this point, like, I don't even guess because I see the craziest things where I'm like, yeah, I guarantee, this is present. And someone's lab work or Dutch comes back and I'm like, okay, that's different.
Yeah. I mean,
but people favor so this is another thing with, adrenals is there's not really two, but like we can say there's two camps. So some people might just be these fast metabolizers or oxidizers or just run high, we'll say. And then other people, they may not have the resilience, just genetics, or here again, maybe just so much trauma from being younger to now that when they are, 30, 40 years old, they're just not quite as resilient. And their tendency is to always have an adaptation. So like, I know like myself, Austin Stout, we're in that camp where I have to take really good care of those stress management pieces. Cause if not, my adrenals are like, girl, we're out. And then other people, they tend to run really high with cortisol and there's, they just work so hard at trying to manage their cortisol because it runs high all the time, which that's no good either. So it's never really fixed, but you just have to kind of know where you preference and just be thoughtful.
What would be some action items for someone who maybe doesn't want to go down the deep dive into blood work and things like that, but wants to kind of make sure that they are managing their stress effectively on a day-to-day basis and using that information for their nutrition and for their training. So what I'm getting at with this kind of question is like, on a daily basis, we are all going to have good days and bad days. All of your clients will have good days and bad days. Good days should absolutely outnumber the bad days. And the bad days should be predictable based on the data that we're seeing. Like, oh yeah, you know what? You slept poorly for 2 nights in a row, for sure, you're gonna have a bad day. But in general, setting boundaries around the things that you need to do, want to do, and probably should do. Then looking at, do you have things in your day that bring you joy? Are you practicing gratitude? Like, are you grateful for life? Are you spending time reflecting on yourself and your role within the world? I think a lot of the time you end up as passengers in life, in the car of life, rather than drivers. People identify with being the person underneath the wheel being run over by life, and they cling to that identity. Mm-hmm. So looking at it in terms of, hey, like, are we tracking these variables? What are the variables telling us? Are we fulfilled in our life? Are we progressing in our training? Right? Are we adding weight to the bar? Are we adding reps? Are we taking minutes off of our times? Are we increasing our outputs? From a body composition standpoint, are we able to manipulate our body composition through nutrition, or does it fight us? Are we seeing a lot of adaptation in terms of, I can eat a ton of calories, but it also takes me a very low amount of calories to diet, right? There's both ends of the spectrum. Looking at, hey, is my body composition meaningfully changing towards the better over time? And being honest with yourself in terms of, are you managing the things that are within your control? For example, are you having massive cheat meals on a weekly basis? Is your sleep schedule really inconsistent? Are you getting regular physical activity on a daily basis and maintaining that? Are you doing some form of cardiovascular exercise to work your heart? Right? And are we doing that in a way that is in balance? I'll use the word balance with our intake, right? So are we matching output and intake? And that comes back to, are we matching our output in the workplace with the positive intake of family life and things that bring us joy? Life is a system of checks and balances. And when we talk about stress, you're writing way more checks than you have money in the bank for. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to either fill up your bank with money, or we're trying to cut down on the amount of checks you're writing. If we can look at it with that simple viewpoint, the answers to these questions do get much simpler. I think we got time for one more question if someone wants to chime in.
Meryl has one in the chat there.
I thought that's what we just answered. Oh, okay. I have a client who just told me that her period is 3 weeks late. She's also noticed about weight gain and noticing some hair loss. Negative pregnancy test. I know her stress levels have been pretty high for a while, and she's not checking a lot of her basic boxes. How would you approach this? She's going to the doctor tomorrow for labs. The first thing I would do is I would bring awareness to the fact that she's not checking the boxes, and maybe remind her of the fact that, her cycle is going to be greatly impacted by stress, especially if she's not on birth control. And then looking into, we can't take any action now until we get the blood work back. Like in terms of active intervention I'll call it an intervention. The reality is any change to lifestyle is going to be an intervention. Bringing awareness to it, and then also educating her on the things that she could be doing, And these are all things that you know already. Like, I know you as a coach, I know you've already brought awareness to it. I know you already made recommendations on things she could change. But I would also ask her why she's allowed herself to get to this point. Or perhaps what's led her to get to this point where she's sacrificed on all these boundaries and she's in the situation that she's in. Because again, she's probably been a passenger. She's probably been just kind of taking whatever comes and being passive. Now she's got to be active. Anything you want to add there, Mare?
Nailed it. That is exactly how I talk to my clients. Most of the clients who ask me if it's been 3 weeks and they're like, should I get lab work? I'm like, absolutely not. Nope. 9 times out of 10. What?
If you're 3 weeks late on your period and you're not pregnant, your blood work's gonna be fucked up.
Potentially, or here again, like checking the boxes. What does not checking the boxes look like? I mean, is she under eating? So we could have nutritional, deficiencies, vitamin, mineral. That's going to have those feedback loops. So like, absolutely, I'm going to be like, don't waste I would personally say if she's paying out of pocket, like, don't even waste your money. Like, don't waste on grabbing the shiny objects out here because, especially like Instagram and social media, everything's about like getting into the functional, health stuff, which is my jam. But man, like the non-negotiables, that is where the foundation, you have gut issues. Guess what? Single ingredient whole foods, make sure you get sleep, make sure you get water. Oh, we have hormone issues. Guess what? Single ingredient. Like I start everybody off the same because how can we even assess everything else if we're not even, eating like 4 meals a day, protein in every meal, veggies, 1 to 2 fruits a day, drinking, at least 3 liters. If we can't do those things, hell yeah, everything's going to go to shit in a handbasket. It's just going to be a matter of time. It's going to affect your sleep and everything else. So start off with the, no pun, but like low hanging fruit, the stuff we can control, like that we truly, honest to God, can control. And for my clients that maybe they're not doing the grocery shopping, then I say, what can you talk to the person who is? What can we do here? And if not, well, let's work with what, is being bought. We can still eat these things and make the best possible choices throughout the day. So yeah.
Instacart.
Yeah, exactly. Instacart, folks.
I started using Instacart during prep and I'm never going to the grocery store ever again.
Okay, so I didn't realize that Instacart delivered in this area, but now I do. So I'm never going either. Or I just send my husband, right? Like,
Mary, you don't leave your house anyway unless you're going to the gym.
It's true. It's true. I know I walk my dog, guys. I do walk my dog.
Her dog walks about 14 feet an hour.
I have to take myself on a walk too, but whatever. He's a senior.
The dog weighs more than I do.
He like moseys. I actually thought about buying. So I'm going to call Paul out here. He has a cart for his dog, or one of them. He has a cart, and I thought about getting a cart for Poopy, but they didn't make a cart big enough to put this 150-pound dog in. And then I'm like, fuck, that's going to be a lot to like tote him around.
Yeah, even with Beefcake's 40 pounds and it's heavy.
That would be my cardio. I could just like, who needs a sled? I'll just push Theo around the. Can you imagine just bull mastiff sitting in a?
I could. He would love it.
He would.
Yeah, Beef hates it. He feels really uncomfortable. Guys, this was really awesome. I hope that you found it valuable. If you do have any follow-up questions after the fact, please feel free to message us separately, and we'd be happy to provide you some answers or lead you in the direction of where you can find those answers for yourself. Mm-hmm. All right. I really appreciate you joining. Have a lovely evening, and you'll be getting an email from me within the next, probably first thing tomorrow morning, with a link to this talk if you want to rewatch it again. All right. Have a lovely evening, you guys. Take care.
Thank you. Bye, guys. Bye.